This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Jamal.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a lot of stories to get through today, but before we get to these stories, there's some breaking news coming from Palestine. Within the last 24 hours, a Houthi missile from Yemen broke through both American and Israeli air defense systems and landed very close to the airport in Tel Aviv, setting off a wave of emergency responses, including the cancellation of all international flights. Despite the United States bombing the port cities in Yemen and laying waste to the civilian population around the port, these missile attacks coming in from Yemen into the Israeli airspace continue very aggressively. So we'll be following this story as we go through the next few weeks. But before we get to that, Jamal, we have a lot of stories to cover today. There's some very interesting developments coming on right now. There was the Gaza flotilla, which has a long history, multi-year, almost 20-year history. And a ship bound for Gaza carrying humanitarian aid and activists was bombed by drones in international waters off of the coast of Malta. We'll be covering that story today. Secondly, and we've covered this story quite extensively on Arab Talk, it's the Hind Rajab Foundation. Hind Rajab was that young Palestinian girl who was murdered by the Israeli Defense Forces as she was injured and called her mother crying to come and save her. She didn't make it. She died. The Hind Rajab Foundation, on her 7th birthday, finally found out who killed Hind Rajab, and they're taking them to court. In another interesting development, Biden staffers admit what we all knew. The White House consistently lied. We knew this, consistently lied about ceasefire efforts. We'll be covering the backstory on that and how Biden officials have finally come clean on that lie. Also, Jamal, on World Press Freedom Day, the United Nations Human Rights Office reported that 211 Palestinian journalists have been killed in Gaza since October 23. More Palestinian journalists have been killed since October 2023 than in decades previous to that of journalists all over the world. They've been targeted by Israeli forces. We're going to be talking about the attacks on Palestinian journalists. And finally, a very interesting poll from the Brookings Foundation. Jamal, Americans are now viewing the labeling of people as anti-Semitic as more often used to delegitimize political opponents and critics of Israel than to actually describe people who are genuinely anti-Semitic. This is a very important poll, Jamal. We'll see if it has any impact. As you can see, we have a lot to cover today.
That's right, Jess. And starting with the main story, which is really, which happened on Friday, early Friday, May 1st. Conscience, that's the name of the ship, part of the Freedom Flotilla Coalition civilian ship, anchored in international waters 14 miles off the coast of Malta, was bombed by drones, blasting its generator and putting holes in the vessel's hull, causing it to take water. The Maltese government said the vessel and its crew were secured in the early hours of the morning after a nearby tug assisted with firefighting options. Now, this is reminiscent of the flotilla. If you remember, the ship that was bombed again to Gaza and was, I think, carrying a Turkish flag and was not only, it wasn't bombed, but it was attacked by Israeli commandos, causing death and destruction on the ship. And actually, this also flotilla had also Turkish nationals on board because the Turkish Foreign Ministry announced that and asked the Maltese government to transfer them safely. Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, remember Greta Thunberg, the darling of the left and the environmentalists in the United States and in the globe. And since she has been visible supporting Palestinians and calling
Right.
for a ceasefire, the media does not cover her anymore. I mean, seldomly. She was, every day in the media, but since she now is a major critic of the genocide that's happening in Gaza, she's been ignored. But anyway, she was about to board the ship. She was supposed to be on board of the ship,
Right. Right.
basically as part of the Freedom Flotillas, and, which planned an action in support of Gaza and break the blockade, and the ship was carrying basically food and water. That's what mostly that the ship was carrying. So Israel hasn't, by the way, admitted that it has bombed, the ship with drones. Just to make that clear. But I mean, who else would have done it, Jess?
Well, of course, Israel did it, Jamal. And who else would breach international waters with drones and attack a humanitarian ship coming into Gaza? And we need to be clear with our listeners and viewers who may already know this, but there's a long history of the Freedom flotillas coming from international waters, which is legal under international maritime law, in order to bring humanitarian food, water, and medicine into Gaza, which is all legal under international law. And the history of this Freedom Flotilla, Jamal, is really, rife with brutal attacks. Let's not forget one of the attacks, Jamal, in which Israeli commandos boarded the Freedom Flotilla, shot and killed members of that ship, and arrested people for weeks and sometimes months, internationals. So Israel continues to commit these illegal international acts. They continue to harass humanitarian aid. Jamal, this is all in the context of now 3 months of blockade of international humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. Reports in the New York Times just today report that starvation is at an all-time high for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, especially the children. So all this flotilla wanted to do was bring in much needed supplies. And of course, a drone attack may seem, kind of to, you know, sorry for the pun, fly under the radar, but it's a classic Israeli move to do something like this. And they did it in international waters. My question back to you, really, is why didn't this get any attention? I mean, don't international attacks or attacks on international waters on vessels like this deserve more attention? I didn't see it anywhere. Did you?
Well, it's the Israel exception, Jess. I mean, every day you have children starving to death, getting bombed, getting killed, and we see now the coverage has been subdued. We haven't actually seen a lot of coverage. I mean, you have a starvation, you have a siege. It's like from the Middle Ages, when
Right.
invaders used to surround a city and starve and cut off water and anything going in and out of that city to basically bring it down. And that's what's going on. I should have mentioned a C-130 Hercules, an Israeli one, was tracked flying towards
Right.
Malta. So that's
Right.
how the drones kind of it wasn't a drone that was launched directly from Israel, but it was dropped off in that vicinity, and that's what at least analysts and activists are saying. But this is, again, it's like added to the many war crimes and attacks and inhumane behavior that the Israelis have been conducting, and now listen, there is a bill now circulating in Congress. I think it should be circulating on Monday, which basically makes it a criminal act to boycott Israel in the United States with heavy fines. So in the United States, I mean, as there is a starvation and there is a genocide going, you in the United States and as an American citizen can boycott Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Starbucks, any company, any American company you would like. But if you boycott an Israeli product, you're subject to fines and punishment. Imagine.
Well, they've tried this so many times, Jamal, and it has failed. What they have done previously, as we've reported here on Arab Talk, is that they've tried to do it within the states. So you do have a number of states like Arkansas and to some extent Texas who have these anti-boycott laws on the books that have been challenged and in many cases have been overturned because they have been found to been illegal. The bill that you're referencing, which is really very important, is an attempt to federalize this, create a federal law that would cover all Americans. Yet another attempt at an unconstitutional stripping away of individual rights, Jamal, having to do with the apartheid state of Israel, right? So I guess they're saying we can boycott American goods as American citizens. We can boycott European goods. We can boycott, Chinese goods if we want. But we have the Israel exception here, I guess, Jamal, because they're trying to pass this legislation. I mean, undoubtedly this will be ruled unconstitutional, but it tells you so much about the current climate of the attacks on pro-Palestine activists. I mean, it must mean at some level that and as we've been reporting, the perception and the polling and the perception of Israel has plummeted. I mean, the majority of Americans really see Israel in an incredibly negative light. And if you're younger, it's even more negative. So perhaps, we'll see this be overturned at some point in the future if it does pass.
Moving on to our next story, Jess, is
very disturbing.
This week, little Hind Rajab should have been blowing out candles on her 7th birthday. I mean, this is she would have turned 7 years old, and on this day of her remembrance and heartbreak, the Hind Rajab Foundation has filed a war crimes complaint with the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in The Hague. After a year, this is according to their website, of tireless investigation, the Hind Rajab Foundation has identified the military unit responsible as well as the commander who led the operation that killed Hind, her family, and 2 medics who tried to serve her. So the Hind Rajab Foundation publicly named the commander responsible for killing Hind, and his Lieutenant Colonel Beni Aharon, commander of the 401 Armored Brigade of the Israel Defense Forces at the time of the killing. And it was under his command that an Israeli tank unit attacked the civilian vehicle of Hind's family, just to remember what happened, and later destroyed the Palestine Red Crescent ambulance dispatched to rescue her. And the Hind Rajab Foundation also confirmed that the battalion operating under his authority in the Tal el-Hawa neighborhood on the 29th of January 2024 has been fully identified. So, as there is an expression, you can run, but you can't hide. I mean, if you have intelligent and dedicated people and attorneys and so forth who are searching for these war criminals, because this is a war crime, and this shouldn't be brushed under the rug. And I mean, there are 2 outstanding warrants to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and of course we know they haven't been arrested. Nevertheless, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelis who committed war crimes, filmed themselves committing these war crimes, bragged about their crimes on Facebook and Instagram and other sites. So I think that's the right attitude, to take, because that's the only way if you're going to have justice eventually, hopefully. And some of these criminals live in the West. Many of them
Right.
are British nationals or American nationals, Canadian nationals, Australian nationals, and they've been basically tracked and hopefully brought to justice.
Well, I think that something you said is very poignant, Jamal, which is you can run, but you can't hide. And part of the impunity with which Israel commits these war crimes is that they've received cover from the United States to perpetrate these crimes against humanity, these destruction of civil society, the mass genocide of Palestinian civilians, and they have come to the conclusion that they can get away with this without any accountability. This is why the Hind Rajab Foundation and the ICC and the ICJ and all the other efforts that are being carried out to hold war criminals accountable for the atrocities that are being committed right now, Jamal, is so important. But I think, when we talk about, the close to 20,000 Palestinian children that have been murdered by the Israeli military, I mean, brutally murdered, and the tens of thousands that are starving to death right now. The story of Hind Rajab really is just breaks our hearts. Our hearts break anytime a child is killed anywhere in the world as a result of these atrocities. But the Israeli attacks and genocide of Palestinian children is especially heart wrenching, and Hind in particular, because you and I, we heard the video, we heard the audio, right, of her crying out loud, begging her mother to not leave her alone and to come and take care of her. It was among the most devastating and heart wrenching moments, anywhere in the world. And so the accountability, especially for this particular brigade, the Israeli military who did commit this murder, is especially important because bringing them to justice will hopefully create this opportunity to hold the entire Israeli military who committed these war crimes accountable. Because ultimately, Jamal, you're right. There can never be justice without this accountability. And who else is going to hold them accountable except these international bodies?
So this is something we've talked about for more than a year during the Biden administration.
Oh,
That
yeah.
the Biden administration never had any intention of forcing Israel into a ceasefire. In fact, we wouldn't have gotten to this point and wouldn't have witnessed the death of more than 50,000 Palestinians in Gaza. The hostages would have been all released several months, the Israeli hostages, I should say, several months ago. But the Biden administration basically, and this is something coming from former Biden staffers who admitted what we all knew, that the White House lied about ceasefire efforts. I mean, saying that we're trying our best with Israel, and Biden had no intention of forcing Israel. And I recall something that, which is those moments maybe people have forgotten. If you remember, just during the 2024 U.S. presidential campaign for progressives who support supposedly Palestinian rights, and then when they witnessed and they were shocked in a way, basically, the progressive leader of the squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who stood at the podium, if you recall, at the Democratic National Convention and told the audience that then Vice President Kamala Harris was working tirelessly to secure a ceasefire in Gaza and bring the hostages home. That was the message.
Right.
Similarly, Kamala Harris was saying that the Biden administration was working tirelessly. That's, if you recall, that was the sentence that they kept all repeating. And now we know that they were all lying, basically. And this
Yeah.
just was a message to just inject some opium into the masses to make them believe that the Biden administration was working tirelessly for a ceasefire when it was not.
Look, Jamal, nobody believed them. Nobody believed Biden. Nobody believed Harris. No one believed Hakeem Jeffries. No one believed Chuck Schumer. No one believed the Biden administration because we could see with our own eyes, Jamal, that Palestinian civilians were being slaughtered by the Israeli military, US made weapons, US made munitions. And even to make it worse, Jamal, and I know you remember this, on multiple occasions, former President Joe Biden, in his state of dementia, many times said in front of the whole world, we are weeks away from a ceasefire deal. You remember that. He said repeatedly, we are so close to a ceasefire deal. I mean, he was lying through his teeth. I mean, notwithstanding that he had this severe cognitive decline and impairment, which is now coming out too, obviously. He was lying through his teeth. They were never close. And they're not close now. They were never close before. Israel continues to be given this pass. But what is interesting, and I think this is part of the story here, is that the conscience of former Biden officials is weighing heavy now as they continue to see the devastation being brought to Palestinian civilians in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, because they see that the lies of the Biden administration are having such dire consequences now. So I think this, although this is a very important story, I don't think it's the end of it, Jamal. I think you're going to have more Biden officials trying to clear their conscience. Not that it really matters for the death and destruction on the ground, trying to clear their conscience of their participation in this grotesque violation of human rights. So I don't know. Did it move you at all to hear the fact that the Biden officials were admitting that they were lying the whole time?
Well, because we knew that, and actually, those who had conscience, if you're talking about conscience, resigned.
Right,
Several did
right,
resign,
right.
but now it's reported that no less than 9 officials from the Joe Biden's administrations, and this was actually also reported on by Israel's own channel, Channel 13, a
Yeah.
news program called Hamakor, which basically means the source in Hebrew, that these officials, including prominent figures such as former U.S. ambassadors to Israel, Tom Nides and Jack Lew, and former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, talked about that. Basically, now and they were supposedly frustrated. And then there was an interview when the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Herzog, was quoted or recorded saying, God did the state of Israel a favor that Biden was the president during this period because it could have been much worse. We fought in Gaza for over a year, and the administration never came to us and said, ceasefire now. It never did, and that's not to be taken for granted. So this is coming from the United States, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Herzog. That's the closest it can get, because the foreign ambassador who is in Washington D.C. is the liaison between the administration
Right.
and the Israeli one, and he's saying that they never. When Biden was telling you, I'm meeting and we're talking about ceasefire, and he's saying point blank that the Biden administration never asked them to have a ceasefire. I mean, it's kind of insane, Jess, when you hear these things.
Well, Jamal, you still have Democrats, so-called liberal Democrats, blaming progressive Democrats, blaming Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Palestine solidarity activists for Kamala Harris's loss against Donald Trump in the presidential election. And if we, just relitigate this, which we've done many times, And they've done all the polling, and they basically said among progressives, the number one issue was the lack of accountability and the lack of ability of the Biden-Harris administration to do anything about this genocide. It has cost the Democrats, it has cost the United States, it has cost the world so much devastation that they have chosen to hitch their wagon to support the Israeli genocide, that we may never fully understand the full toll of this illegal, immoral, unethical breach of international law and human rights that the Biden administration did, giving Israel this pass. And I just want to say, because we said this so much, Kamala Harris deserves so much blame for this, because not only did she lie about the working hard, we're coming to a ceasefire deal anytime, but it's because of her and her campaign and her inability, and you remember this during the Democratic convention, to allow any discussion of criticism of Israel and have people speak about it.
And it's
So,
not noteworthy just that the Biden administration did all of this for Netanyahu,
right.
despite the fact that the Israeli prime minister made no secret of his support for Donald Trump, because that
Exactly.
actually, we're talking about why they lost. And that it was undeniable at the time that Democratic voters disapproved of Biden's blind support for Israel. And so when this is, to your point, why the Democrats lost, why they lost the White House, and they just continued and kept using this buzzword, tirelessly working for a ceasefire. It was intentional to deceive the American public and to deceive the voters, basically. That
People
was
didn't buy it. But people didn't buy it, Jamal. No one buys it. Does anyone really believe? Did anyone really believe that the United States was so weak that if it didn't go to Netanyahu, if it didn't go to Israel and say, stop this immediately, they wouldn't do it? Give me a break. Nobody believed that they were actually fighting for a ceasefire. And they kept wringing their hands. Oh, Netanyahu this, Netanyahu that. He doesn't listen, blah, blah, blah. Well, that was a lie too. Netanyahu listened very carefully. And basically what these reports are saying that we're reporting on today is that the Biden administration and Kamala Harris never told the Israelis to stop. So the U.S. complicity in this genocide remains even more bleak. And I think that's the story here. The lying of the Biden-Harris campaign, nobody believed it. And now the consequences of that, which the entire world now is reaping, Jamal. We have no ceasefire. Millions of Palestinians are starving to death. Children are dying from starvation. And Donald Trump is creating a kind of attack on every single aspect of our constitutional rights in the United States. So we have no one else to thank, Jamal, but Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for what we have right now. And they refuse to take responsibility. It was painful, Jamal. I don't know if you saw this, but Kamala Harris was invited to give a speech, her first time giving a national speech in San Francisco this last week, condemning the Trump administration, standing up for these rights, when in fact, she is really the most complicit in the destruction of our civil rights right now. So it was kind
Well,
of...
also, I just should mention AOC was speaking the other day, and somebody interrupted her and reminded her about her complicity in
Yes.
in the genocide, and they tried to kind of silence that woman. Actually, they did eventually take her out of the hallway, but that's the reflection, because
Okay.
it just seems to me that the Democrats haven't learned their lesson.
No.
And despite, and we'll talk about, because we've been talking about the polls last week or the week before, we talked about the new poll that showed that 53% of the American voters are not happy with what Israel is doing. And if you take that to the younger voters, the numbers go in the 60s. And then if you separate it between Republicans and Democrats, it's the Democrats who are basically reject Israel at a peak of 68%. And so they haven't learned what the constituency wants, and they still keep talking they use the same language. And, I mean, I shouldn't use the cliche, but isn't it that, repeating something time and time again and expecting a different outcome is a sign of insanity?
Yeah. I mean, the Democrats are not going to learn, Jamal. They are sending this country into an abyss, and fealty for Israeli genocide and Israeli fascism and Israeli, ethnic cleansing. They would rather feel loyalty to that than loyalty to this country, loyalty to the Constitution, and they will continue this decline. The Democrats, Jamal, are lost. They're completely lost. They don't know what to do. They keep, as you say, harping on these old tropes that nobody believes anymore, and they're losing voters. No one is going to vote for Democrats anymore, Jamal. And, AOC has lost her luster. No one. I mean, Kamala Harris is so reviled right now. She can't even win to be the governor of the state of California. So, I say, it's on them. Someday they'll take responsibility. I doubt they're going to do it soon, but this political, kind of avenue that they're taking about, oh, we did everything we could. No one believes it, Jamal. Nobody believes it.
So this week also just is the World Press Freedom Day.
Yeah, sad.
And as the world observes World Press Freedom Day, the United Nations Human Rights Office in the occupied Palestinian territory has issued a stark warning about the escalating death toll of Palestinian journalists. In a statement, the office confirmed the killing of 211 journalists in Gaza since October 7th, 2023, including 28 women journalists. And press vests, this is part of their statement that they've issued. Press vests have transformed from a means of protection to a target for attacks.
Yes.
And that's what we've been reporting on. When the number of journalists who were killed reached 100, just if you recall, there wasn't an outcry. The world didn't flinch. And now the number has surpassed 200, which is basically puts it as the highest in like 100 years. I don't think even during the Vietnam War, we had this number of journalists killed on the field as we're seeing in Gaza.
And if you look at it per capita, Jamal, if you look at the number of journalists that have been killed, Palestinian journalists that have been killed per capita, there's nothing on the planet that even comes close. You can compare it to the most repressive regimes anywhere in the world who openly attack press freedom. Nothing compares to the amount and the number of Palestinian journalists that have been killed. And I might add, this number says 211 Palestinian journalists that have been killed in Gaza since October, but this doesn't include the attacks on journalists in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Palestinian journalists in general are under vicious attack throughout historic Palestine. So, where is the journalist community on this? I mean, what they used to say about journalists, Jabal? An attack on one is an attack on all. That's the whole foundation of this World Press Freedom Day. That journalists have to be protected for a vibrant democracy. I don't see that in Palestine.
And also should mention that journalists detained who survived basically by Israeli forces have reported to the UN Human Rights Commission that they were subjected to beatings, humiliation, and sexual and gender-based violence during interrogations about their journalistic work, a pattern of abuse that the UN says fits into a larger pattern of intimidation and smears against Palestinian press. So this is your answer to that, because a lot of these journalists get arrested mostly in the West Bank,
Right.
and but the journalists who operate in Gaza, not only they get targeted, but they get targeted in their homes, killing
Right.
their families, killing their children, killing their wives. I can't now recall all the stories and witnessing all these attacks on these journalists when they, um, you know, some of them even they weren't home and their homes were attacked, and so
Right.
they find out when they were reporting in front of a hospital, on the death and destruction caused by an Israeli bombing, and then they found out themselves that some of the victims were their family members.
Exactly.
It's totally shocking. And so, how can the world celebrate this day? I mean, and talk about it. I mean, where do I see, like the press freedom? Where is that the word freedom in word press that you can
Yeah.
celebrate?
Yeah. This is the Palestine exception for journalists, Jamal, because, you would expect American journalists to be screaming at the top of their lungs about the attacks on Palestinian journalists, but we haven't heard that. We haven't heard any American journalists of any note say anything about this. It's really a sad day. And, Israel also, this, and they did this a while ago. They closed down the Al Jazeera office in the West Bank. So Al Jazeera can't even report from the West Bank from what's going on right now. So the situation is pretty grim. Thankfully, Palestinians continue to use social media to get the word out to the world about what's happening in Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem right now, Jamal. So thankfully, we still have social media being able to get the word out of the atrocities that are being committed.
Moving on to our final story for the day, and this is another poll, because
Yeah,
as I mentioned, and we'll talk about the Pew poll and the Gallup polls actually that happened. But this is by the Brookings, and I don't know, what do you think? But I think the Brookings Institute is a very conservative
it is.
institute,
It is. It's very
right?
conservative.
Yeah, so that's the Brookings, and which is basically says that Americans view labeling people anti-Semitic as more often used to delegitimize political opponents and critics of Israel than to describe people who are genuinely anti-Semitic.
That's a big deal, man. Coming from the Brookings Institute, that's a really big deal. And we see waves and waves of weaponizing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to attack critics of Israel, to attack protests, to attack the encampment movement. Students are being, censured. They're being dropped by their universities. They're being suspended. People are getting fired at work, all because all because they are being critical of a genocide. In fact, there was this is somewhat related. There's a famous uh, uh, musician, Kelani, who's actually from the Bay Area, who was supposed to give a lecture at Cornell University. And they canceled her at the last minute because she was anti genocide. So this Brookings poll, Jamal, really speaks to how Americans feel. The majority of Americans see right through this. They see that attacks on people who are anti-genocide, pro-human rights, being labeled as anti-Semitic, nobody buys it. They see it as a weaponization of the construct of anti-Semitism. And the problem, we've talked about this, we've had guests talk about it, it really takes away from legitimate kind of legitimate anti-Semitism, which is out there, primarily coming from white supremacists, primarily coming from people, who are MAGA supporters. I mean, you have MAGA supporters giving, a Nazi salute at events, and they get away with it. But if you happen to be critical of a foreign policy or critical and anti-genocide about what's happening in Palestine, you get labeled as anti-Semitic. So it's clear that this is being used as a weapon, and unfortunately, it really is going to put people at risk because legitimate anti-Semitism is being ignored right now. It's really dangerous.
So the Brookings broke it down into like these different terms, like frequently,
Right.
sometimes, and so forth. So the findings, basically, this is I'm just giving the at least the percentages in particular, and since June, that they found out that when asked their impressions about how labeling people anti-Semitic is used in the American political discourse, 51% said that labeling is used to delegitimize political opponents, and that's frequently. So that's the frequently. 21% said it's sometimes, and so these numbers, by the way, those numbers went up to 67%. And I
Wow.
mentioned from June. I'm sorry, I should have said June 2023, but then those numbers went up to 67% in July 2024.
Wow.
So look at the major jump, and let's face it. Just I mean, you've talked about these labels. If you talk about a genocide, then you are labeled as an anti-Semite. If you say Israel is committing a genocide, if you say that Israel is an apartheid state, which was defined by its own human rights organization, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations. So if you repeat that, those are like big reports. You could about apartheid. Hundreds of pages of why these organizations came to this conclusion. And if you use that terminology, then you are also an anti-Semite. So any of these things, any kind of criticism will earn you the label to be called an anti-Semite. And by the way, these findings are supported by the new, which I mentioned earlier, major polling from Pew and Gallup. And just to remind our listeners, the Pew poll found that a majority of respondents, 53%, have an unfavorable view of Israel, an increase of 11 percent points from 42% a couple of years ago.
Right.
And as the Pew report noted, the share of U.S. adults who voice very unfavorable views of Israel has roughly doubled over this period. That's a double, Jess.
Double. Well, you might think that pro-Israel groups and the Israeli government would take notice on this, that they're losing the hearts and minds of the global community. No one buys this rubbish that the Israeli government and frankly the American government is selling anymore. People really see right through it. They see the reality on the ground of what's happening in Palestine, especially to Palestinians in Gaza, and then they hear this other rubbish. They see people being attacked for just standing up for human rights. So, and they're losing. I mean, look at the Pew poll, look at the Brookings poll, look at all the polling that is done. But as we mentioned, just earlier in another segment, do you really think that they're going to change their attitude on this? Doesn't look like it. They're headed down this path of their own destruction. I mean, it's pretty clear they're not going to change it. They are weaponizing anti-Semitism to crush any kind of dissent and any kind of criticism of this foreign policy. It's backfiring, obviously, but it's clear they're not going to change, Jamal.
No, it's not. And I should add that notably since 2022, all segments of the public examined have shown increasingly unfavorable views of Israel, including Democrats, who rose the numbers from 53% unfavorable in 2022. So even before the election, the
Right.
Democrats had an unfavorable view that the Biden administration didn't listen to that.
No.
And now in 2025, do you want to know what's the percentage, Jess?
What's
It's
the number?
69%.
Oops.
Yeah, from 2022. And then the Republicans, they rose from 27% to 37%, which is a 10% increase.
Wow.
And the Democrats age 50 and older, whose unfavorable views increased the most. I thought it would have been the young, but I guess the young always had an unfavorable view.
Right.
But Democrats who are over 50 years of age, their unfavorable view rose from 43% to 66%, basically aligning now with younger Democrats. So that's where you get the 69% Democrats. So now it's not just the young students,
Right.
because we actually talked about this, but I think we were wrong. And we were saying it's really the college students and the young, but it's not. Within the Democratic Party, also adults and older adults are view Israel unfavorably. Yet again, I go back to you. Will the Democrats or will the Democratic Party change? Will they change their agenda or their platform and their slogans during elections?
I have a very easy answer to that, Jamal. They're not going to change. The Democratic Party has been hijacked by pro-Israel forces. Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, they have recommitted themselves to Israel and to Israeli genocide, to the ADLs, to AIPAC, and things like that. They do not represent what their constituents are saying. They do not represent the majority of what Americans believe in. They do not represent core American values, which believe in human rights and believe that committing genocide against civilians is bad. And they will pay a price eventually, Jamal. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will pay a price. They've obviously paid a price because they lost the Senate, they lost the House, they lost the presidential election, and they're still not learning.
Then the writing is on the wall
Of
with
course.
all these text messages that you and I receive and millions of Americans receive. We need money because the midterm elections are coming and we're going to do this and we're going to do that.
No one buys it.
You know, they're in a panic.
They should be in a
And
panic.
normally, if you look historically, midterm elections are not good for the sitting
Party of power.
administration,
Right.
right? So if they're not going to cease that, and they're not going to flip Congress, for example, that's their opportunity to flip Congress, then they're finished.
I have no sympathy for the Democrats, Jamal. I have no sympathy whatsoever for their ongoing kind of assault on truth and their inability to face the reality of what Americans really want and believe. It's on them. They don't represent anymore what people believe and what they want. And they will continue to pay a price, including AOC, right? The so-called darling of the progressive elements of the Democratic Party. They will continue to lose. And, you know, it's on them.
I remember two things that happened, and that actually, because we talk about the writing on the wall. One was when, during the DNC convention, when they refused to mention the word Palestine
Right.
on their platform, and they had discussions with Arab Americans to be actually what they wanted to say, that they'll be balanced when it comes to Palestine and Israel, and refused to do that. The second part was during the convention, when they refused to have a Palestinian to go on stage for a few minutes after she presented them with her speech and gave them the free, the freedom to edit whatever she was going to say. They pulled the plug on her, pulled up the plug on her. And those were the two indicators that turned off people, or especially young people. But now, when I'm looking at this poll, it's not just the young people who are turned off. It's everybody in the Democratic Party. So again, I go, repeat the expression: the writing is on the wall. Their leadership is going to continue with this attitude they're not going to win any seats.
No. And they have no one to blame, Jamal, but themselves. They could blame Arab Americans. They could blame Palestine solidarity activists, but they're just kind of projecting and displacing the blame onto somebody else. They have only themselves to blame, and they need to take that responsibility.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll speak to you next week.
See you next week.